The man known to history as Theodore Robert Bundy was born on the 24th of November 1946 at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, as Theodore Robert Cowell. His mother was Louise Cowell, a department store clerk and the eldest of Philadelphia businessman Samuel Cowell's 3 daughters. According to her, Ted was the product of his mother's brief fling with the mysterious World War II veteran Jack Worthington, who she met after graduating from high school in 1946. They split up when Louise was 7 months pregnant, after which Louise moved from Philadelphia to the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, an organization that assisted pregnant single mothers at a time when having children outside of wedlock was looked down upon. After Ted was born, Louise and her newborn moved from Philadelphia to Tacoma in Washington state to move closer to her uncle Jack Cowell. Encouraged by her friends to attend young adult nights at the local First Methodist Church, one night Louise was swept off her feet by a native and soft-spoken North Carolinian called John Culpeper Bundy, also known as Johnny, who had just left the Navy. In May 1951, the couple married. The union would lead over time to the arrival of Ted's 4 half-siblings, Linda, Glenn, Sandra and Richard, who were born respectively in 1952, 1954, 1956, and 1961. Although quiet and reserved, Ted's stepfather, who he believed to be his biological father for many years, could be violent if provoked. The intricacies of Ted's multifaceted personality have been extensively debated by very experienced psychologists, without any firm conclusions being agreed upon. The defense psychiatrist, Dr. Dorothy Ottnow Lewis, alluding to the way in which Bundy could suddenly switch from one version of himself to another in an instant, as many of his victims would experience in their last moments, would suggest he suffered from an acute case of bipolar disorder. Others have noticed that he displayed all the hallmarks of antisocial personality disorder, notably a complete lack of remorse, a penchant for violence, disregard for truth and social norms, and a materialistic urge to steal. The one thing there is a general consensus on is that Bundy was a sociopath or psychopath. In addition, Bundy displayed elements of a litany of disturbing deviances, such as biastophilia, in which arousal is heightened by the assault of a person who doesn't consent, as well as voyeurism and sadism. In appearance, Ted Bundy was a good-looking and charming man who had brown curly hair, which he later shortened, piercing blue eyes, and an athletic figure. Like a Venus flytrap, he used his charisma to lure in his prey and to avoid detection by the police. With no distinguishing features that made it easy for the authorities to identify him, he also had the ability to change his appearance substantially, with small alterations such as the addition of a mustache, the growing out of his beard, or the adoption of a new haircut. The earliest manifestation of Bundy's violent tendencies may have occurred when he was just 3 years old, when his Aunt Julia woke up to find herself surrounded by kitchen knives and her young smiling nephew. Aside from this, however, from the outside he appeared to be a normal child, who believed in Santa Claus and hated vegetables. Yet, as he would later reveal in unusually candid interviews, which he gave not long before his execution, it was from this early age that he first fell to creeping, a vague uneasiness that would later spiral into an uncontrollable impulse to murder. During his first 3 years living with his grandparents and mother in Philadelphia, due to the stigma surrounding single mothers at the time, Bundy was led to believe that his grandparents were his real parents, and that his mother was his elder sister. This was further complicated when he was told that his elder sister was actually his mother, and that his stepfather Johnny Bundy was his real father, with many stating that this initial identity crisis may have helped create his fractured personality. It probably did contribute to some degree to his nebulous sense of not belonging. In 1954, following the birth of his half-brother Glenn, the Bundy family moved into a larger home in a new neighborhood to accommodate their growing brood. And it was here that Ted met his 2 best friends from childhood, Terry Storwick and Warren Dodge, who quickly learned that Ted had a very short fuse. Storwick. As Bundy grew older, he tried his hand at team sports such as basketball and baseball, but he was never able to get on the team, a fact that greatly embarrassed the extremely self-conscious adolescent. As a result, he decided to take up solo sports, such as skiing, which he practiced using expensive ski equipment he had stolen, a fact that would have greatly shocked his family friends, who only knew him as a regular churchgoer with ambitions to pursue a career in law enforcement. This tendency towards kleptomania would become stronger over time, and was a central part of Bundy's unusual psychology, with him later describing his more violent crimes in terms which indicated that he wished to almost steal the life essence from his victims. Ted's rebellious streak would take an ominous turn when, according to the most likely version of events, his true parentage was revealed by his antagonistic cousin John, who procured his birth certificate to prove to him that Johnny was not his real father. Resentful that his mother had lied to him about his origins, Ted became even more dismissive of his stepfather, and henceforth refused to call him Dad, starting to only refer to him as John. The resulting friction caused Johnny, who was an otherwise mild-mannered man, to lash out more at his stepson when he was provoked. Going from middle school to Woodrow Wilson High School, Bundy, whose outward charm hid a chronic lack of self-confidence, described it as the moment he decided to socially withdraw from society because he suddenly found it impossible to integrate or relate to his classmates. From then on, he would only ever feel truly himself when he was in the classroom. Taking comfort from its formal setting, he spoke up regularly in class, cultivating an image of the serious-minded intellectual to hide his loneliness and his inability to understand other people, especially the wants, needs, and desires of girls, which mystified him. Living from home in his freshman year at the University of Puget Sound, Ted began developing the outward appearance of a normal, functioning human being, while on the inside, the malevolent elements of his personality were still stirring. In the first year at Puget Sound, he kept to himself, but his narcissistic tendencies meant that he didn't want to be entirely invisible, and, looking for something a tad more glamorous to shroud his true nature, he applied for a transfer to the University of Washington's first-class Asian Studies program in Seattle to study the Chinese language. In Seattle in 1966 and 1967, he began to open up a little more to other people, and he soon started receiving attention from a fellow student, Diane Edwards, who had been identified under various aliases in studies of Bundy's life. Despite his attraction to her and their tendency to spend their nights together, Ted made no sexual advances, as if introducing physicality into the relationship would somehow corrupt it. In an effort to continue spending time with her, Ted enrolled in an intensive Chinese language course at Stanford University. However, he soon failed most of his classes, and soon his unimpressed girlfriend, who had also become increasingly annoyed at his childhood habit of sneaking up on her, broke up with him. After their breakup, he returned home irritable and depressed, and by 1968, feeling worthless, he was back in Seattle, where he rented a small apartment, worked as a busboy in a hotel dining room, and as a night stalker in a Safeway store, and started committing acts of petty thievery. Then, one day, Ted bumped into an old acquaintance from high school, who suggested that he volunteer to work for Art Fletcher, a local city councilman who was the Republican Party's nominee for the upcoming elections for lieutenant governor. A staunch Republican, Ted jumped at this opportunity and he approached the unpaid position with enthusiasm, eventually being named Art Fletcher's personal driver and a bodyguard of sorts. It was during this run also that Ted, who most studies agree had not had relations of any kind up to this, had his first such experience. This occurred at a campaign party. Having got very drunk and been whisked away to a colleague's house to rest, he describes how in a semi-conscious state he had seen an unknown woman enter into his bed. She undressed him and proceeded to engage in intercourse with him. Not long afterwards, when his job on the Fletcher campaign came to an end, Bundy found employment as a salesman in a Seattle department store. This didn't last long, though perhaps the experience, along with his time working around political types who didn't mean what they said, cultivated his ability to talk his way out of situations and charm people into doing what he wanted, skills that would become integral to his brutal activities in the 1970s. Soon he headed out to Philadelphia to continue his studies at Temple University for one semester in 1969. That autumn, though, he was back in Washington, and at a local bar, Bundy met Elizabeth Kendall, a 24-year-old medical secretary from Utah and single mother of a daughter named Tina. Falsely introducing himself as a law student who was writing a book on the Vietnam War, Elizabeth fell for him immediately, and they began a relationship. Ted and Elizabeth's whirlwind romance blossomed so quickly that after 3 months they were both seriously considering getting married. Yet Ted's lies would eventually catch up to him. He soon had to reveal that in actual fact he was a university dropout, working as a legal messenger. Elizabeth forgave him this and many of his other toxic traits, which included seeing other women to make her jealous. Underneath the surface, though, Ted's sickness was getting worse, and it was around this time that he began watching violent pornography and prowling around after dark, peeping into women's windows and stealing things, often for seemingly little reason. Driven by a need to understand his own confusing psychological makeup, Bundy began a new major in psychology at the University of Washington, where for once he did well academically, graduating in the spring of 1972. Thereafter, he stated his desire to study the law, but he soon realized he was not well suited for a legal career and was rejected by numerous law schools. Then, with the assistance of a grant, he began working with psychiatric outpatients at the Harborview Hospital in Seattle. These were years of flux for Bundy, and he also returned to politics, volunteering as a helper in the upcoming local election campaign on behalf of Governor Dan Evans of the Republican Party. To all those who knew him on the campaign trail in 1972, Bundy was an intelligent and handsome man with a bright future. Yet to his girlfriend Elizabeth, much of his behavior was increasingly unsettling. She would later recollect that he threatened to physically harm her if she told anyone about his peculiar stealing habits. On another occasion, he strangely came back home with a surgical glove bulging from his pocket and retrieved a crowbar from behind a radiator. Another night, she awoke to find him examining her body with a flashlight under the covers. In assessing all of this, it should be noted that while the first murder which Bundy can be absolutely connected to would not occur until 1974, investigators in the late 1970s and 1980s became convinced that he had committed several murders as far back as the 1960s, and when he was dating Elizabeth in Seattle in the early 1970s. After the 1972 election, and armed with a profusion of supporting documents, which included a letter of recommendation from Governor Evans, Bundy managed to secure a place at the University of Utah Law College for a course that started in the autumn of 1973. It was in the months leading up to the program, while he worked briefly for the Seattle Crime Commissioner's newsletter, writing articles on sexual assault prevention among other subjects, that he would first make a splash in the newspapers, not as a vicious serial killer, but as an everyday hero. Whilst out shopping with Elizabeth, Ted ran after and apprehended a purse stealer, pinning him down until the police arrived, resulting in an article in the local Seattle Times that praised his bravery. It was events like this, and his recommendations from leading political figures in Washington state, that would later make police disinclined to pursue Bundy as a potential perpetrator of some of his crimes in the mid-1970s. Around this time, based on advice from Marlin Vortman, another veteran of the 1972 Evans campaign, who recommended that Ted should pursue law school at the nearby University of Puget Sound, rather than the out-of-state University of Utah, Bundy decided to do so. His reasoning being that if he wanted to get involved in state politics at a later stage, it would be useful to get to know the local magistrates. Taking Marlin's advice, he enrolled in night law school at the University of Puget Sound, to the bewilderment of Elizabeth, who was beginning to realize that she had little or no influence on his actions. Starting at the University of Puget Sound in a nondescript office building in downtown Tacoma, Ted soon realized that he had signed up to a truly second-rate school, and by December 1973, he had started secretly reapplying to the University of Utah. While Bundy might have outwardly appeared to be a relatively normal character at this time, one who had a committed girlfriend, had volunteered in numerous political campaigns, and aspired to become a lawyer, In reality, his nefarious behavior and psychology was about to start manifesting itself in a more appalling manner. Early in the morning of the 4th of January 1974, Bundy committed the first major crime that we have concrete information concerning. At approximately 2 a.m. she shared with 3 other men on 4325 8th Avenue in the University District of Seattle. The next day, when she still hadn't emerged by 7:30 p.m., her housemates entered her room and discovered to their horror that she had been savagely beaten around her head and was close to death. She was immediately sent to hospital. Remaining in a coma for 10 days, she would survive, though with permanent brain damage. Bundy was responsible for the attack. It is highly unlikely, however, that this was the first such crime Bundy had committed, and one of the most recent biographies of Bundy claims he had killed as early as 1961, when he was little more than a teenager. By the time he attacked Terry Caldwell, he was already a journeyman murderer. Over the next decade, Bundy would gradually refine his methods to become one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. He was aided immensely in the crime spree that followed by the fact that CCTV was not widely used in the 1970s, and many other types of digital evidence which could be used to catch a serial killer today, were also not available in the 1970s. DNA evidence, one of the best methods of catching murderers today, would not enter widespread use in law enforcement until the 1990s. Impediments such as these, when combined with Bundy's tendency to argue and charm his way out of tight situations, would facilitate his murders over the next several years. A month after Terry Caldwell narrowly escaped death, Bundy struck again, this time against one Linda Ann Healy. On the 1st of February 1974, having returned to her apartment which was minutes away from Caldwell's, Healy went to bed, only to be snatched from it quietly in the early morning hours and never seen again. Her death is generally regarded as the first of Bundy's confirmed murders. The next was Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student studying at the Evergreen State College in nearby Olympia, who on the 12th of March 1974 was abducted whilst on her way to a jazz concert. Bundy later disclosed that he incinerated her skull in his girlfriend Elizabeth's fireplace while she was out. After this, on the 17th of April 1974, Bundy lured Susan Elaine Rancourt to his car by pretending to be a disabled man who needed her help to carry some heavy books, a method he would use regularly thereafter to kidnap many young women. Soon after he killed Rancourt, Bundy informed Elizabeth of his surprise decision to transfer to Utah in September, making it seem to her as if it was a recent choice, despite him having already organized it 4 months earlier. In the meantime, Ted landed a summer job at the Washington State Department of Emergency Services, or DES, where his main priority was to work on the institution's biannual budget, a perfect cover for his secret double life. Over the next several months, Bundy continued to commit several murders. By now, clear patterns were emerging. Bundy would often kidnap his victims, who were all young women in their late teens and the first half of their 20s, before taking them to more secluded places where he would typically force himself on them before committing the murder, before disposing of the rest of the body. In later years, it would also be revealed that Bundy began returning to the remains of some of his victims. It was also around this time that he expanded the geographical area in which he was operating. For instance, when he kidnapped 21-year-old Roberta Kathleen Parks, this occurred in Oregon, not in Washington State. Not long after, on the 1st of June 1974, he kidnapped and murdered 22-year-old Brenda Carroll Ball after she left a popular student dive bar, the Flame Tavern, in Burien, Seattle. In a sign of his growing mania, it was just 9 days later, on the 10th of June 1974, that Bundy struck again. This time the target was Georgianne Hawkins, an 18-year-old freshman at the University of Washington, who that night had taken a break from studying for her exams to attend a party. Walking home in the dark, Georgianne came across Bundy, masquerading as a disabled man. He hit her over the head with a crowbar, handcuffed her, and then drove her to a rural location. She was never seen again. The changes in Bundy's behavior had not gone unnoticed amongst those who knew him in his life as a citizen. For instance, a work colleague of Ted's from this time noted that between June and August 1974, he seemed to lose a lot of weight, upwards of 15 pounds. A notable change in him was also detected by his girlfriend Elizabeth, who noticed that his sexual appetite had markedly increased from spring 1974 onwards, as had the frequency of his bizarre and erratic behavior. This came to a head on the 6th of July 1974. On that day, while the couple were river rafting, Bundy suddenly pushed Elizabeth into the water, and when she came up for air to scold him, he icily made no response, later explaining that it was just a joke. She didn't leave him at this juncture, but she became increasingly suspicious of his behavior in general, in ways which would have implication for Bundy in the long run. By late 1974, a police investigation was underway. As the killings and disappearances of young women in Washington state had mounted throughout the year, police were starting to suspect that there was a more malevolent explanation and pattern to these. However, the full horror of what they were dealing with only became apparent in mid-July. According to eyewitnesses, on the 14th of July, Janice Ann Ott, a 23-year-old probation officer, was lounging around in a black two-piece bikini in the park near Lake Sammamish when she was approached by a man in an arm sling, asking her if she could help put his sailboat on his car. Bundy then led her to a pre-selected area and had his way with her before killing her. Yet he was still not satiated, and by now Bundy was developing a sense of invincibility as he committed crime without any repercussions. Thus, directly thereafter, he made his way back to Lake Sammamish. There, he met 18-year-old Denise Nusland. Just over an hour after Denise disappeared, Ted was at Elizabeth's door and complaining that he was starving. They both went to a local joint where he devoured 2 enormous hamburgers, much to her surprise. Once it was established that both young women who had been at Lake Sammamish on the 14th of July 1974 had disappeared, detectives started receiving their first descriptions of the anonymous killer, who had felt audacious enough to commit his crimes in open daylight, and whose movements during the day had been observed by hundreds of eyewitnesses in the first major mistake of his homicidal career. As a result, from personal accounts and observances, it was learnt that the potential killer referred to himself as Ted, and that he drove a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. The published sketches were alarming for Elizabeth, who couldn't help but notice Ted's familiar jawline, and equally couldn't ignore the fact that the depicted monster was known to drive the same car as her boyfriend. On the other hand, there were also many discrepancies that made her downplay her suspicions. Yet these would only re-emerge in the months before his departure, when she discovered a hatchet in his car, and noticed that he had shaved his hair extremely short. Nevertheless, she still wasn't fully convinced, and so when Ted left for Utah in September, days before the decaying remains of Janice Ott and Denise Nusland were discovered, she embraced and kissed him before he left. Traveling down to Salt Lake City and by himself at last, the Grim Reaper wasted no time satisfying his carnal cravings. And once he got to his destination, Ted Bundy was noticeably absent from his classes for 6 weeks, while he familiarized himself with the local area. A new killing frenzy started on the 2nd of October 1974, when 16-year-old cheerleader, Nancy Wilcox, was picked up by Bundy in the small city of Holiday, Utah, and never seen again. Bundy would later confess to her killing, although peculiarly, much of the testimony that he provided concerning her was later found to be false, and her body was never recovered. Just over 2 weeks later, on the evening of the 18th of October, 17-year-old Melissa Smith, who was the daughter of the Midvale Chief of Police, Lewis Smith, left the Pepperoni Pizza Palace only to be abducted. Rather shockingly, when her body was discovered 9 days later, it was determined that she had only been dead for approximately 3 days, opening up the horrifying possibility that she had gone through a 5 or 6 day ordeal at Bundy's hands. Even more disturbingly, it was observed that Smith's makeup had been reapplied, her nails had been painted, and that her body had been cleaned, as if she was some kind of doll. As the news of these disappearances proliferated around the state, parents Jim and Shirley Aim of Salem, Utah, took the opportunity to remind their carefree 17-year-old daughter Laura of the dangers of hitchhiking, but she shrugged off their warnings. It would prove to be a fatal miscalculation, for on Halloween night 1974, after leaving a party at about midnight, she would come face to face with Bundy, when she stuck her thumb out on Highway 89, looking for a ride into the city of Lehi. By now Bundy was feeling unstoppable, so there was no reason for him to suspect that his next catch would get away from him. On the evening of Friday the 8th of November, whilst shopping for a gift at Fashion Palace Mall, 18-year-old Carol Durant was approached by a handsome man with a mustache who introduced himself as Officer Roseland. Informing her that her car may have been broken into in the car park, she and the stranger went to her Chevrolet Camaro, only to find it completely untouched. Bundy then requested she jump a residential area, sharply parked up, and pounced on her. In the kerfuffle that ensued, Durant managed to open the passenger door just as he placed a handcuff on her right hand, but in the confusion he accidentally locked the other cuff on the same hand, rendering it useless. Durant fled from the car and ran away down the street, freeing herself from the grasp of her terrifying assailant. Shivering with fear, Carol Durant was picked up by a friendly passerby. Quite incredibly, by then Ted Bundy was already speeding north on Interstate 15 towards the city of Bountiful, in a depraved search for another victim. Parking up near Viewmont High School, which was putting on a performance of the musical The Redhead, he rashly entered the auditorium lobby in view of several hundred people, and after approaching a 24-year-old drama teacher, Ray Lynn Shepard, with no luck, he paced up and down the auditorium until he spotted 17-year-old Deborah Jean Kent leaving mid-performance. With everyone distracted inside, Bundy knocked her out cold while she was in the car park, re-entered the auditorium slightly disheveled to make it seem he didn't leave at the same time as her, only to return to his car and unconscious victim. Bundy would confess to her murder 15 years later. With the police no closer to identifying him as the perpetrator, despite his increasingly reckless methods, that Christmas, Ted Bundy spent time with Elizabeth and her family in Utah, feeling fairly confident that he had evaded detection. Unknown to him, however, Elizabeth had heard of the Utah murder of Melissa Smith and was growing increasingly suspicious of her boyfriend. Yet she ignored the various red flags for the time being and convinced herself that her Ted, so friendly and at ease with her parents and family, wasn't capable of such atrocities. At the beginning of 1975, with the manhunt in Utah making it far too risky for him to operate there, Ted changed his hunting ground to the ski resorts of neighboring Colorado, while also turning up to his law classes in Utah in order to provide some future alibis if needed. On the 12th of January 1975, just 12 months after his murderous campaign had first commenced, 24-year-old Karen Campbell took the elevator to the second floor of the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village in Colorado in order to retrieve a magazine. It is thought that Bundy took advantage of the massive amounts of steam rising from the outdoor pool to conceal the moment he approached her, as she walked the short distance to her room, which she never reached. Her body was found a month later. After the Campbell murder, Bundy took a brief trip back to see Elizabeth in Washington state, whose suspicions about him temporarily subsided. Nevertheless, when he returned to Utah, the creeping doubt set in again, prompting her to make calls to the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office, expressing her concerns. Yet the detective on the other end assured her that they had already checked out Ted Bundy and found nothing to suggest he was a plausible suspect. This was despite the fact that in the first months of 1975, the bodies of many of Bundy's victims, who were just listed as missing up to that point, were discovered, potentially expanding the range of evidence available to investigators and clearly confirming that there was a serial killer on the loose, operating not just in Washington state, but in Utah and Colorado as well. After his return to law school in Utah, Bundy focused his activities on the small town of Vail, Colorado. One night there, he dressed up as a disabled man with crutches, his by now common method, and went looking for a victim. It wasn't long before he spotted 26-year-old Julie Cunningham strolling to a nearby tavern and asked her to assist him with getting to his car. She obliged a person who she thought was relatively harmless, only to quickly realize he wasn't. After hitting her over the head, handcuffing her and driving to a secluded location, Bundy choked her until she passed out, purposefully leaving the passenger door open so that when she woke up, she would think she could escape. When she did, Cunningham made a run for it, just like he wanted. He was simply toying with her. After letting her go for a short distance, he chased her down and added her to the list of his victims. A couple of weeks later, in early April 1975, 24-year-old Denise Oliverson met her end in Grand Junction, Colorado at Bundy's hands. He dumped her body in the Colorado River before heading back to Utah to send Elizabeth flowers for her 30th birthday. Worse, if that was possible, was to follow. Exactly a month after killing Oliverson, Bundy was in Pocatello, Idaho. There he happened upon Lynette Culver, a student at Alameda Junior High School who was only 12 years old. He lured her into his car and they drove back to his room at the Holiday Inn. Culver's body would never be recovered, and for many years the official status of her case was that she was missing. But in 1989, shortly before his execution, Bundy confessed to her murder. What makes all of this especially sinister is that just weeks later, Bundy was back in Seattle with Elizabeth and her young daughter Tina, who was not of a dissimilar age to Lynette Culver. As with previous occasions, Elizabeth's suspicions concerning her long-term boyfriend abated when he was present, but then resumed when he was gone, and she saw things on the news which seemed to yet again point the finger of suspicion towards Ted. For his part, Ted was soon engaged in another killing, this time in late June in Provo, Utah, when 15-year-old Susan Curtis was returning the short distance to her dorm to brush her teeth for the Bountiful Orchard Youth Conference banquet later that evening. She became the last unlucky soul to die a nightmarish death in 1975 at the hands of the monster, before he was finally identified as the probable killer. At 2 a.m. on the 15th of August 1975, Ted Bundy was parked up on the side of the road with no lights on in his car, studying a map of Salt Lake City. He was high on marijuana and intoxicated. This was not an uncommon feature of Bundy's activities, and he would later explain that he usually drank a lot while committing his crimes. On this particular evening, it would be his undoing, as Sergeant Bob Hayward of the Utah Highway Patrol approached his stationary vehicle in his patrol car, whilst on the lookout for thieves. Startled by the sudden interruption, Bundy speedily drove off. Hayward swiftly followed in pursuit and soon chased Bundy down. After surveying Bundy's driving license, the police officer searched the car, finding handcuffs in the boot and a brown gym bag in the passenger seat, stuffed with the paraphernalia of kidnap and murder. This included a 7-inch nylon rope, a tan-colored ski mask with a dark stripe, a brown cotton glove with leather hand grip, a black leather ski glove, a box of trash bags, a flashlight, some 4-inch orange wire, 8 strips of white sheet material of different lengths, an ice pick, a Sears Model 6577 crowbar, and surely the most bizarre item of all, a pair of pantyhose cut with eye and nose holes to use it as a mask of some sort. Believing he had found burglary tools, Hayward arrested him and the suspect was whisked to jail, where he was photographed, while his murder kit was taken into police custody. Released in the early morning hours of Saturday the 16th of August 1975, the following Tuesday, during a weekly meeting attended by lawmakers from all the surrounding counties and states, the news of Bundy's arrest sent his name to the top of the suspect list. As investigations intensified and focused on him, lots of evidence seemed to now point in his direction. Hence, on the 21st of August 1975, Bundy was arrested again at the front door of his apartment. Over the following weeks, investigators continued to make connections between Ted Bundy and the different murder cases in Washington State, Utah, and Colorado. Obviously, the fact Bundy had moved to Utah to attend law school around the time that the focus of the murders shifted from Washington State to Utah and Colorado was incriminating. But the smoking gun really came on the 8th of September, when it was discovered that Bundy's gas receipts from his Chevron oil card matched the various locations where the crimes had occurred. Lawmakers were now certain that they had caught the killer. Now it was just a matter of threading together the grisly tapestry. On the 2nd of October, after being identified in a lineup by Carol DaRonch, Viewpoint High's drama teacher Ray Lynn Shepard, and a friend of Debbie Kent, Theodore Robert Bundy was arrested for the kidnapping and attempted murder of Carol DaRonch. setting off an unprecedented media storm in which his picture was plastered over every national newspaper. During the early stages of proceedings in late 1975, a time when Bundy was quite incredibly free after paying the $15,000 bail that had been set, but was being tracked by detectives, many of his former colleagues and friends rushed to his defense, unwilling to believe that the man they had known from various political campaigns and law schools was a serial killer. Nevertheless, one by one, each of his advocates would in time come to the shocking realization that the police were right. Meanwhile, while he waited for his day in court that had been set for late February 1976, Bundy made a show of proclaiming his innocence and wove the narrative that he was at the center of a miscarriage of justice. Despite his expressions of his own innocence, when the trial commenced, it took less than a week for Judge Stuart M. Hansen Jr. of Salt Lake County to declare. While this initial conviction had gotten Bundy off the streets, it would prove to be the least of his worries. For quietly in the background, Colorado lawmakers were assembling a much larger and more comprehensive case against him that would be centered on Karen Campbell, the young woman Bundy had murdered in the Wildwood Inn in Colorado in January 1975. Having procured eyewitness testimony that placed him in the Wildwood Inn, and having also presented Bundy with the gas receipt he had signed and received at the nearby gas station on the day Campbell vanished, on the morning of the 28th of January 1977, Bundy was charged in Salt Lake County Prison with Campbell's murder. There would be more twists and turns though. In April, Bundy announced that he was going to defend himself in the upcoming Maine trial, a move which meant he was given access to a law library. It was while there on the 7th of June 1977 that he absconded through an open window on the second floor of the Aspen courthouse. This first effort at escape, though, ended after just 5 days. At that point, Ted was stopped in a stolen car heading out of Aspen, apprehended and sent back to Garfield County Jail. Thereafter, he was forced to wear leg irons and chains in court. In December 1977, believing that being judged outside of Aspen would increase his chances of acquittal, and against his lawyer's advice, Bundy successfully sued for a change of venue for his trial to El Paso County, Colorado. Happy with himself that he had been able to persuade the judge, Bundy was shocked to be informed moments later by his lawyer that El Paso County was actually Colorado Springs, a precinct famed for the amount of death sentences it handed out to murderers. Realizing his fatal mistake, the color from his previously mirthful face drained instantly, and according to one investigator, the change was in microseconds. The man that was in the dark had just been exposed to the brilliant light of day. It was this revelation which drove Bundy to make a second escape attempt. On the 30th of December 1977, using books and clothes to simulate a person lying on his bunk, and with more than $700 of legal donations stuffed in his pockets, he struggled into the crawl space above his cell, broke into the chief jailer's empty apartment above, took some of his clothes and walked out of the front door to freedom. This second escape attempt was initially more successful than the first. Days later, Bundy was on his way across the country to Tallahassee, Florida, via a plane and several stolen vehicles. Taking an upstairs room at 409 West College Avenue, and going by the name of Chris Hagen, he initially decided that he was going to get a normal job and to refrain from further acts of violence. However, the all-too-familiar violent urges soon emerged, and by mid-January 1978, he was visiting student nightclubs in Tallahassee. This eventually led him to the Chi Omega sorority house, where, after grabbing a wooden log from a woodpile and driven by animal rage, he first snuck into Margaret Bowman's room and quietly bludgeoned and strangled her, before moving shark-like into Lisa Levy's room, where she was beaten and choked as she slept. In a fit of uncontrollable madness, he had also bitten her as she lay dying, leaving behind an incriminating indentation of his teeth marks. Before he left the crime scene at 3:15 a.m. to return to his residence, he also severely battered Karen Chandler, Kathy Kleiner, and Cheryl Thomas, all of whom survived. As Tallahassee awakened to the horrifying news of the attacks, Bundy joined a group of residents at his accommodation who were discussing the disturbing incident. Here, as though he could not resist tangentially boasting about his experience as a serial killer, he was overheard saying that this was probably a professional job, and the guy has done it before. With Tallahassee still reeling in horror, in early February, Bundy, now looking increasingly disheveled, checked out of the Holiday Inn and cruised down to Lake City Junior High School, where his eyes fixated on 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach. According to an eyewitness who thought she was his child being punished for some wrongdoing, he brought her to the passenger side of his van, shoved her in, and then careered uncontrollably down the highway as he tried to drive and restrain Leach at the same time. Then, finding an abandoned hogshed 30 minutes later, he sexually assaulted her before murdering her. Not long after, he resolved to head over the state line to Alabama, but on the way he was spotted by patrolman David Lee, driving through the suburb of Brownsville with no headlights on. Bundy was traveling in a stolen Volkswagen, almost as though he was taunting police by traveling in the same make of vehicle he had used when committing his murders back west in 1974 and 1975. Lee soon confirmed that the car was stolen and began to arrest Bundy. As the patrolman secured one cuff, the suspect hit him in the face and tripped him before running away. But he was eventually subdued. Ted Bundy had been caught, and there would be no further escape attempts hereafter. One of the first things that Bundy did while in custody was to phone up Elizabeth Kendall. On the call, he told her that he was consumed by a sickness he couldn't comprehend. But he remained tight-lipped about the Chi Omega murders in Florida when pressed by her, as if he was too ashamed to talk about it in what would be their last ever conversation. After multiple interrogation sessions, during which he didn't directly admit his guilt but alluded to it, Ted Bundy was indicted for the Chi Omega murders in July 1978. Preparing for the upcoming trial in June 1979, he completely undermined his own cause by declining to plead insanity to save himself from the death sentence. For in Bundy's twisted mind, assault and murder were not mental aberrations at all, but something he considered to be accomplishments. If he tried to claim he was innocent by reason of insanity, he would be renouncing the murders altogether. He also rejected a plea bargain that would save him from the electric chair if he admitted in open court that he had killed Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman and Kimberly Leach. Owing to all of this, on the 23rd of July 1979, it was decreed that Bundy was guilty of the attempted murders of Kathy Kleiner, Karen Chandler, and Cheryl Thomas, as well as the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. With the matching teeth marks found on the latter's body, the prosecution's star evidence. He was subsequently sentenced to death by the electric chair. Any chance of appeal went from remote to nil the following January, when he was also found guilty of murdering Kimberly Leach. Just before he was handed another death sentence, at 10:31 a.m. on the 9th of February 1980, the 2-year anniversary of Leach's abduction, Bundy married Carol Ann Boone. She was a former work colleague from his days at the Washington State Department of Emergency Services. In the late 1970s, while he was facing numerous trials, Boone had become his girlfriend because she wholeheartedly believed in his innocence. Being unable to reconcile the idea that the individual she had worked with back in 1974 could be guilty of the crimes he stood accused of. Over the next several years, she visited him regularly and was allowed conjugal visits, such that on the 24th of October 1982, a daughter was born from their marriage. They named her Rose, Bundy's only known child. It was only in 1986, after many more revelations of her dawning realization that the man she had married on death row had in fact committed the crimes which she had been found guilty of, that Carol divorced Bundy in 1986. As he rotted on death row throughout the 1980s, Bundy became the subject of 2 of the decade's most popular bestsellers. The first being The Stranger Beside Me, written by crime reporter and former work colleague Anne Rule, who had maintained a friendship with him since the early 1970s. And the second being The Phantom Prince, My Life with Ted Bundy, authored by none other than Elizabeth Kendall. While these could be viewed as cynical efforts to cash in on their author's close relationships with one of America's most notorious serial killers, in both instances there was a genuine desire to explore how they had been so conned by Bundy. This was especially the case with Elizabeth, who doubtlessly felt she had to clear her name to some extent with public opinion, after being in a relationship with Ted throughout much of the time that he was mass murdering young women across Washington state. These were not the only revelations concerning Bundy in the 1980s. In 1984, via interviews which he agreed to give to Bob Keppel, who was investigating a catalogue of murders committed by the notorious Gary Ridgway, otherwise known as the Green River Killer, some insight was given into the distorted psyche of Ted Bundy. Keppel noted the lack of remorse and hardly contained glee of Bundy when he was presented with pictures of some of the remains of his victims. Keppel also noted that Bundy sounded envious when the topic turned to the killings Ridgway had engaged in. On the 19th of November 1986, 6 hours before he was scheduled to be electrocuted for the murder of Kimberly Leach, and to the dismay of the general public, a U.S. Supreme Court judge ruled that his death penalty should be delayed while investigators re-examined his psychological state during the 1980 trial. Nevertheless, justice would eventually catch up with Bundy, and the execution was soon rescheduled for the 24th of January 1989. With the realization that he would soon die, Bundy began to These included carrying out post-mortems of his victims. He also explained how he took deep, even mystical satisfaction from feeling their last breaths leave them and seeing their eyes glaze over, and how in his mind this inextricably linked them together for eternity as he presided over them like God. On the 24th of January 1989, after a life of unimaginable cruelty, it was finally Ted Bundy's time to die. After having his hair shaved off and applied with special conducting gel just before 6 a.m. and confessing to 2 more murders, those of Susan Curtis and Denise Oliverson, he was led to the Grey execution chamber at 6:57 a.m. As he was being strapped in, and as a black hood was applied to his head, Ted uttered his last words, which were directed to his lawyer Jim Coleman, who had fruitlessly tried to stay his execution at the last minute, and Fred Lawrence, the Methodist minister, who had counseled him in his final days. These were, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." At 7:06 a.m., the hooded executioner pressed a button on the electric chair. Bundy clenched his fists once and then twice. After a minute, the power was turned off, and a paramedic confirmed he had no pulse. Then the black hood was taken off by prison physician Dr. Frank Kilo to reveal lifeless, half-open eyes. "He's dead," announced Kilo to the silent room. Ted Bundy is one of the most notorious serial killers in history. Coming from a somewhat dysfunctional background, though hardly a particularly bad one. In his earliest years, Bundy's sickness was first expressed in small acts of rebellion and occasional outbursts. But some studies argue that he may have committed his first murders when he was little more than a teenager. Unfortunately for those who wish to reconstruct Bundy's life, these events in it remain shrouded in mystery. What is altogether clearer are the events of the 1970s. Having spent years drifting aimlessly between college courses and jobs, without many successes, he began to settle down to some extent in Washington state in the early 1970s, in a relationship with Elizabeth Kendall and attending law school. But unbeknownst to Elizabeth, in early 1974, he commenced a campaign as a serial killer. Over the next 4 years or so, and through multiple arrests and 2 prison escapes, he murdered over 24 young women and teenagers. Though investigators believe the number is probably over 30 for his entire lifetime. Psychologists and other analysts have tried to assess what drove Bundy and what psychological maladies drove him to do what he did. The reason this has proved so difficult is that he was clearly a complex mix of someone who was psychotic, narcissistic, had borderline personality disorder, and a range of sexual paraphilias. All of this combined in Bundy in an immensely toxic way, with the fact that he was capable of living a double life in which he appeared relatively normal to those around him, including his long-term girlfriend, but in reality was mass murdering people by night. Even when he came close to being caught on several occasions, he charmed his way out of the situation. Incredibly, on nearly every occasion that he was arrested, whether originally in 1975 or following his escapes from prison, it was actually bad driving that was his undoing. Thankfully, with the advent of DNA evidence and other technological developments over the past half-century, it is highly unlikely that anyone could ever engage in the activity which Bundy did in the 1970s and get away with it for as long as he did. What do you think of Ted Bundy? Do you think he was the most horrific serial killer to have ever lived? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for watching People Profiles documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.